Have you ever listened to a podcast where they're interviewing an expert and suddenly that person starts talking about a topic they know nothing about, but they're spouting off and you're like, why don't you stay in your lane? Well, today I'm here to explain why, and I will be responding to this video that came out recently called The Downfall of Modern Podcasts by James Smith, where he talks about this problem of misinformation in podcasting. Some of it I agree with it, some of it I don't. We'll talk about it, but here's his main thesis.
The problem starts becoming apparent when you start looking at guests. In the beginning, you want fantastic guests who can arrive and change people's lives and give people so much information and get massive amounts of views and grow your channel to 5 million subscribers. But you will exhaust the amount of great guests very soon. And you can get those guests back on, or what we're starting to see is you bring on guests not who are known for being factually correct or objective, but that you know will cause controversy, cause a rift between the followers, cause massive amounts of engagement, cause people to be so outraged that they go and watch the podcast just to see what's factually incorrect in it, and of course, get huge amounts of views.
Okay, so he talks about this supply and demand problem. There's lots of podcasts now. Everyone has a podcast, and they're all fighting over the same limited number of guests. There's only so many great guests out there who are good speakers, they're experts in their field, and they want to go on a podcast in the first place, right? And everyone's competing over that limited resource, and so eventually people start to go away from the objective, factual guests and towards the less objective, sensationalist guests. Now, I agree with part of that. I agree that there is absolutely a supply problem. I also agree that podcasts aren't just trying to dispense facts, right? They know who gets views, etc. But I actually think that there is a danger when you are brought on as an expert to quickly go from that objective, accurate guy into someone spouting nonsense very easily. And it's not just like a clear-cut difference, like I'm either objective and accurate or I'm sensationalist and spreading misinformation on purpose. I think there is that, but I think the problem actually lies in there's so much content that needs to be made when you start getting into this like podcasting world that these experts that get brought on are only experts in like half the conversation in maybe 1 hour, and then they run out of things to talk about. They just don't have enough things they're experts in to be objective and truthful about. And so then they start talking about some culture garbage or whatever is in the news, right? Because that's everyone can always comment on that. And I am saying this as someone who has not only run a podcast, it was kind of like a live stream thing. It was kind of a podcast where I quickly found myself running out of things to say because I was like, I don't know. I'm not an expert in this, but let's just talk about it, right? So I found myself in that. Eventually, we shut it down. And then I also found myself on the like expert side of these podcasts where I'm brought in as somebody who knows something about scams, and they talk to me about it. Now, let me tell you, because I'm going to bring up some examples, but I'm also going to bring up an example of myself that specifically on Joe Rogan. We talked, when I'm on these podcasts, we'll talk for like an hour and a half. For an hour and a half, like I'm solid. And the longer you go, the more I just start to drift out of because you just kind of run out of things that you're really knowledgeable about. And you just get lured into these conversations that you're not so, you don't have a lot of expertise in. And that's where I think a lot of this misinformation can happen. And I think this is especially true when you bring on guests for a second time. So let's go through a few examples of this. And we will talk about them, including my own. But we'll start with Eric Weinstein. He's a hedge fund director and podcast host. He's one of these guys that gets brought on all the time as some smart guy, a public intellectual. Well, here he is in a clip on this Chris Williamson podcast. The title of the clip is, "What Do Modern Men Want in a Man?" Eric Weinstein. Well, let's remind ourselves what Eric is. He has a PhD in mathematical physics, and he is a hedge fund director, a former hedge fund director. What does he know about modern women? Can anyone explain that?
Masculinity. I have to be very careful as I ask, because they certainly respond more than they're supposed to according to modern rules of femininity.
Correct.
But my guess is that it's greatly decreased from the market for masculinity in the 60s, let's say.
What are we talking about? This isn't hedge funds. This isn't mathematics. Eric Weinstein is spouting off about modern date. When's the last time this guy has a modern... What are we doing? Okay? But I don't blame Eric, okay? It's not like I'm out here trying to roast. I'm not trying to get after anybody because I myself know the pressures. You're sitting in that chair and you've kind of talked about the things you're going to talk about, and there's just more time, you know? Or you were on here last time. You already explained all your ideas. Now we got to talk about something random. Here's another clip. Neil deGrasse Tyson, do this every morning to find your happiness or whatever. Okay, so in this 1.5 hour show, they talk about a lot of things. They have this long riff of, well, it's not that long. It's like, 8 minutes long, about where does happiness and meaning come from. We won't go through the whole clip, but it's like, Neil deGrasse Tyson is a physicist. He's a public kind of science educator, promoter. He's not a happiness guru. He's not a philosopher. Nonetheless, he's asked about this. Now, okay, am I saying that experts should only talk about things in their area of core competency? No. But it can be very confusing when in a podcast you are just seamlessly going in and out of these topics, right? So you're watching a clip and there's nowhere it signals to the audience like, hey, this is something he knows a lot about, versus he has no idea about this. He's just kind of giving a hot take. And you're just kind of rolling through. It's a whole roller coaster. Now, let's talk about me. Let's talk about your old pal. I have faced this myself, and I've actually stopped going on so many podcasts because I've noticed this was happening. So it's just something you have to be mindful of that happens on podcasts. In this case, I'm going to show you a case where I managed to dodge the bullet a little bit, but bear in mind, I'm sure there are instances where I didn't, okay? But this is just what I thought of when I was thinking about this. This is the Joe Rogan Experience. Here we go.
And
by the way, it's context. We've been talking about scams for most of this episode. And then we were just sort of like, after this, we had run out of the main like things we're going to talk about. So we're just kind of riffing. We're just talking, whatever. It's like two dudes in a bar.
And respectable and, to that person, and refer to them in the gender that they want is nice. It's a good thing to do. But why is that problem something that gets you banned for life? But you can call someone a cunt, and that's fine.
I have no idea. See, this is why I stay in my lane of scams, because I'm just like, it's impossible.
Yeah, you have to stay
It's
in a lane.
impossible to, and ultimately, like, one of the things I realized, so I consider myself.
Woo! Dodge that. But sorry, I didn't want to show you guys the full clip. It's kind of longer. But I basically get to ask this question about like dead naming people on Twitter. Bro, what do I know? Nothing. I know nothing about that. But I'm asked about it, and everything else I've been an expert in. Am I just going to, it's easy to just be like, well, here's what I think, just spout off some random opinion. But you shouldn't listen to me because I don't know anything. This is not something that I've studied. I haven't studied social networks and what their I don't know. Who knows, right? So that is a case where I did not, talk about it, whatever. But actually, I would argue that that's less interesting of an answer than spouting off on some hot take. And I would argue that to be the most successful podcast guest, especially recurring podcast guest, where you have 3 hours of new material, every week on some new podcast show, you have to be able to respond on the fly to those types of things. So I wanted to add this sort of more, I don't know if like insider context makes sense to this idea of modern podcasts. I agree there is a supply and demand problem, but I don't think that the only problem is the difference between a well-informed guest and a not so well-informed guest, or like just a sensationalist guest. I do think there is that, but just if you have the same person on for enough time, the lengths of these podcasts go, you just can't be an expert in all of it. And it's not like some crime of the century. This is not like, oh, podcasts are, I think the title of the video was The Downfall of Modern Podcasts. I don't know if it's like going to ruin anything. I think people like when people riff, but I do think it causes some problems with misinformation because enough time goes by and you're going to hear Eric Weinstein's opinions on modern women. Anyways, that's basically it. I just thought that video was pretty interesting. I'll link it below, The Downfall of Modern Podcasts. I wanted to respond to that particular part. He makes a few other interesting arguments, and yeah, that's basically it.